In this video, I'm doing page 99, number 4. This gives you a number of different markets and two scenarios, two cases, and then asks you to determine the difference or the change in the demand or supply curve, equilibrium, price, and quantity. So in part A, the problem asks you to consider the market for newspapers. And in case 1, we're told that the salary of journalists goes up. So I'm just going to write this down. And I know that I'm going to be trying to discern the difference in equilibrium, quantity, and prices. So I'm going to start with my supply and demand model. Quantity is on the horizontal axis, price on the vertical axis. I'm going to start with a hypothetical supply curve that's upward sloping, reflecting profit maximization on the part of our suppliers. A downward sloping demand curve that reflects consumers following the law of demand. When price goes down, they demand more. And I'm going to assume that we begin at this equilibrium point here where supply equals demand. And if I drop down from that equilibrium point to the horizontal axis, I have a point where the quantity demanded is the same as quantity supplied. And that's exactly our equilibrium point. And so this is the equilibrium quantity that corresponds to the equilibrium point. If I move from this equilibrium point over to the vertical axis where price is, I then have my equilibrium price that corresponds to that quantity. And so just to recap, what equilibrium means is that suppliers of newspapers have said, okay, at this equilibrium price, let's say it's $1.50, we're willing to produce, say, a quantity of 200 newspapers. At the same time, consumers walking out into the market and seeing a newspaper at the price of $1.50 have said, okay, at this price we are willing to purchase 200 newspapers. So the quantity supplied is exactly equal to the quantity demanded at that equilibrium price. The question asks you to consider the case if the salaries of journalists go up. Well, you might consider that if journalists are the ones who are creating stories for a newspaper, they effectively act as an input into production. And if they act as an input into production, then what this case is saying is that inputs into production have increased. If they have increased, then the supply of newspapers will decrease because the inputs have gotten more expensive. Now, rather than show you the shift and then tell you whether we're in supply, surplus and shortage, and showing how we move to the new equilibrium, I'm going to start just showing the shift and then showing where the new equilibrium is. After going through the kind of explanation that I did in the last problems, I hope you can refer to those problems to figure out how we get from our old equilibrium to the new equilibrium here. This is our second equilibrium. If I come down, I see that I have a place where I have I'm just going to draw an arrow here, a new equilibrium quantity and a new equilibrium price. And if the way that I got to equilibrium 2 doesn't make sense, I'm happy to talk about it in office hours. So again, the supply curve has shifted to the left because the supply of newspapers has decreased as a result of the journalist's salary going up. And so we have a new equilibrium. And as a result of that new equilibrium, the equilibrium quantity of newspapers has decreased and the equilibrium price of newspapers has increased. So that is case 1. In case 2, we are told that some event happens in the town that's reported by the newspaper, and so we would assume that the demand for newspaper is going to go up. They don't tell us that, but they say there's a big news event and it's reported in the newspapers. And so here we might see an increase in the demand for those newspapers. So again, I'm going to draw my quantity here on the horizontal axis, price on the vertical axis, a hypothetical supply, a hypothetical demand. I know I begin at this original equilibrium. And again, I'm moving a little bit faster because I've done problems like this where I've explained every single step. And so now I hope that from doing the homework, you're moving into a spot where doing this is a little bit more straightforward, so that I don't have to go through each and every step. So I dropped down to the horizontal axis to get my equilibrium quantity, came over to my vertical axis to get my equilibrium price, and now I'm being told there's a big news event, and that news event is being reported in the papers. So we might consider that there's an increase in a shift in tastes in favor of newspapers, which results in a new demand curve that's shifted outward, is increased demand. As a result, we end up at this new equilibrium point where old supply meets new demand. And again, I'm going faster through this, but there is a period where this market is not in equilibrium and we're either in supply or shortage, and then move to our new equilibrium. And I walk through that process in problems 2 and 3. So if this looks like it's going a little more quickly, then refer back to those problems or see me during office hours. So from this new equilibrium point, I come down to the horizontal axis to get my new equilibrium quantity and my new equilibrium price. This should actually be equilibrium price 1. And if I compare my two equilibriums and the quantity and prices that go with them, I see quantity has increased and price has increased. In part B, I'm being asked to consider the market for St. Louis Rams cotton t-shirts. So I'm just going to put t-shirts. And I'm going to consider the supply and demand model for t-shirts, as I usually do. Quantity on the horizontal, price on the vertical. A supply curve, a demand curve, and a first step at equilibrium. And case 1 says the Rams win the Super Bowl. Well, if the Rams win the Super Bowl, you might consider that there's a shift in tastes in favor of getting t-shirts. More people want t-shirts with the Rams logo if the Rams have won the Super Bowl. Of course, this is assuming that you are a Rams fan. So my demand curve is going to shift outward to represent increased demand for the t-shirts. And there's a process by which we will eventually end up, the market mechanism is eventually going to have us move to a new equilibrium. And I forgot to show you what the equilibrium quantities are that correspond. So I'm going to do that now. This is equilibrium price 1. And then if I drop down here, I have equilibrium quantity 2 and equilibrium price 2. And when I take a step back and take a look, I can see that equilibrium quantity has increased, equilibrium price has increased. And that should be intuitive. If the Rams win a Super Bowl, then the demand for the t-shirts with the rams on them is going to increase, and that increase in demand is going to occasion an increase in supply, because the price will start to go up as demand starts to increase, and suppliers will want to supply more to the market. And that's what this supply and demand model is showing us. In case 2, they tell us that the price of cotton increases. I started with my supply and demand model from last video, and I'm just going to add on to it. I took some things away that related to the first case, and so now I'm going to think about the second case. But I did exactly the same procedure. Drew price and quantity axes. I started with a supply and a demand curve, marked equilibrium, came down to mark equilibrium quantity, moved to the left to mark equilibrium price, and now I'm going to consider what happens if the price of cotton increases. Well, remember that they told us that these are cotton t-shirts. So cotton is obviously an input into production. And if the price of cotton increases, well, then producers looking at that price increase will want to supply less. Their costs have increased. So this supply curve is going to shift over to the left. And as a result, our new equilibrium is going to be with where old demand and new supply intersect, which is at this point here, which I'm going to mark equilibrium 2. And coming down to mark my new equilibrium quantity, and moving over to the vertical axis to mark my new equilibrium price, I can say that equilibrium quantity has decreased. Suppliers have supplied less to the market. They can now get less profit from the amount of t-shirts they were previously putting out on the market at a certain price, because their own prices for the inputs into that t-shirt have gone up. So they're going to supply less. At the same time, the price also has increased. So they've raised their prices and pulled more product out of the market. In part C, we're asked to consider the market for bagels. So before I look at the problem, I'm going to set up my market with quantity on the horizontal axis, price on the vertical, a supply curve, a demand curve. I'm going to mark my equilibrium, mark my equilibrium quantity, mark my equilibrium price. This is where my market for bagels begins. Now I look at how my story is going to change. In case 1, people realize how fattening bagels are. So we imagine that we have consumers who are maybe concerned about their weight, and we consider that their tastes have shifted away from eating bagels. So their demand for bagels has decreased. And so we have a new demand curve. And I'm just going to repeat, because once in a while I like to repeat my reasoning for things. And we've gone over this before, but remember when we talk about a change in a supply and demand model, when we want to tell the difference between whether we're shifting or moving along a curve, it really depends on what is the catalyst for change. If the catalyst for change is a change in the price of the good that we're modeling, which is in this case bagels, then we're talking about a movement along the curve. So for instance, if I were to say that the price of bagels increased, well, then I would shift my equilibrium point along the demand curve from equilibrium 1 to, say, maybe over here where this pink dot is here. It would not be a shift in the demand curve. But with any other change in a factor affecting demand that is not the price of the good, then we're talking about a shift of the entire demand curve, which is why I've shifted this demand curve to the left. So now that I have shifted it, I know that I have a new equilibrium where the old supply and new demand intersect, and that's at this point here, equilibrium 2, sub 2. And I'm going to mark my new equilibrium quantity, my new equilibrium price, and then take a step back and consider what has happened in my market. In my market, as a result of people finding out that bagels are fattening, or realizing how fattening they are, the quantity of bagels in the market has decreased, and the price of bagels has decreased. Continuing on with my same supply and demand model for bagels, I'm now going to consider case 2. Let me see what's going on here. So case 2. So case 2 says that people have less time to make themselves a cooked breakfast. So a couple logical leaps you have to make here. We might imagine that if people don't have time to make themselves toast and eggs in the morning, that they might just grab a bagel instead. That's going to be a time-saving alternative. As a result, we would expect this to increase the demand for bagels. More people have less time to make breakfast, they'll grab a bagel, and so the demand for bagels will increase. And I represent that as an outward shift, a shift to the right of the demand curve. It's a shift, again, because the price of bagels has not changed. People's tastes have changed as a result of having less time. There will be, the market mechanism will bring us to a new, ostensibly will bring us to a new equilibrium sub 2, the second equilibrium. And if I just correspond this equilibrium to its quantity and its price, and take a step back, I can consider what has happened in my market for bagels as a result of people having less time to cook themselves a breakfast in the morning. The quantity of bagels has increased. The price of bagels has increased. So you might imagine a situation where people, maybe the laws for how many hours a day you can work are changed so that the max is 10, so people are now generally working 10 hours a day instead of 8. Because of that, they have less time to make themselves breakfast in the morning. They go out and start demanding more bagels. Suppliers respond by supplying more bagels to the market and increasing their prices. And that brings us to a new equilibrium where consumers and producers essentially shake hands and say, yes, this is the deal we've made. For this price, we're going to consume this much, and at this price, you're going to supply this much, and we're both happy. That's the fairy tale of our market. In part D, we are asked to consider the market for your textbook. Krugman and Wells, Macro, the book you have. So this is a really shameless example on the part of Krugman and Wells, but nevertheless. We have this market here, quantity supplied or demanded on the horizontal axis, price that corresponds to, on the vertical axis, we have a hypothetical supply curve that shifts upward left to right, and a downward sloping demand curve. We imagine we start at this equilibrium. That corresponds to this equilibrium quantity and this equilibrium price. And case 1 says that, which is literally true in your case, which is that your professor makes it required reading for all of his or her students. So I have assigned Krugman and Wells textbook. How is this going to change the market for Krugman and Wells textbook? Well, think about what happened at the beginning of the semester. I made it required reading, so you had to go and actually purchase this textbook. Now, the price of the textbook didn't change. That's not why you purchased more textbooks. It didn't all of a sudden become cheaper. You purchased more because I assigned the text in our class. It was required. So this is a shift in demand. Outward because it's increased. And as a result, the market mechanism is eventually going to bring us to a new equilibrium here. Our second equilibrium that corresponds to a new equilibrium quantity and a new equilibrium price. So imagine there's a lot of professors like me who assign this textbook in class. Well, what this supply and demand model is trying to model is the fact that if a lot of professors start assigning this book, you're going to see the demand for this book increase. And Krugman and Wells, sitting back watching this increase in demand, might come to a point where they realize that they don't have enough textbooks out on the market. So now they're going to put more textbooks on the market and also take advantage of the increase in demand by raising the price of the textbook. Until the point that you as a student and Krugman and Wells as suppliers of a textbook agree that you will buy X amount of textbooks for a certain price, and Krugman and Wells are willing to supply X amount of textbooks at that price. That place where you kind of shake hands and all your glory and happiness is equilibrium 2. And if I take a step back and look at what's happened in my market, I see that equilibrium quantity has increased. Krugman and Wells have pushed more textbooks into the market, and the price of these textbooks have increased. Moving on to case 2 in part D. Now we're told that the printing costs of the textbook you have are lowered because of the use of some synthetic paper. So what this tells us is that at the same price, if we start from equilibrium, at that same equilibrium price now, Krugman and Wells can actually make more textbooks because their own costs have decreased. So the supply curve now shifts over, oh, that's a bad supply curve, but you get the point, over to the right. The supply at that price has increased, and it's a shift. The market mechanism will bring us to a new equilibrium point, equilibrium 2, which corresponds to an equilibrium quantity and an equilibrium price. If I take a step back and look at what has happened in my market as a result of this synthetic paper, which is you can think of as a technological innovation, which increases supply of a good, the quantity has increased. More textbooks have come onto the market. And this should be 2, actually. And the equilibrium price has decreased.